Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a diver enters an underwater cave and never returns. Did he drown in a tragic accident? Or did something more sinister happen? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my inimitable co-host, Alice.
Wow, that's awesome. That's like a great line that uses that word in Hamilton.
Which one is that? Do you remember the line?
Now I'm trying to think. Because I can never sing it because it's difficult. Okay, now I have to wait 1 second. Let me.
I look forward to you singing this
for
the podcast.
The song is literally called. It's Leslie Odom Jr., who has the voice of an angel, and he plays Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr, sir.
Exactly. I have a shirt with a cat on it, and it says, "Are you Aaron Burr, sir?" Okay.
Wow.
So the line from Hamilton, which is Aaron Burr, the whole dichotomy within Hamilton is that Hamilton is everything off the cuff and it drives Aaron Burr crazy because Aaron Burr sits back and waits for the right moment. And the line is, I am inimitable, I am an original, which is beautiful. I'm not falling. Beautiful. Oh gosh, he's so good.
So good. Why don't you just sing the whole
I would really like to, but then we'll really
lose start.
If people think our opening song is too long.
Yes, that's true.
I don't even know what to say here. Anyways.
Well, thank you to Thomas for that. Alice, you are inimitable. No one can imitate you. You are an original. So.
And are you calling me Aaron Burr?
Sir?
I'm sorry,
just don't shoot me one day, okay? That's the key.
Oh, jeez.
Hey, it's another late night broadcast from the Prosecutors, so sorry for a little loopy, everybody. But
no one's going to know us when they meet us during normal hours and we're not loopy.
I know. We're just boring and straightforward. Well, in any event, it's good to be back with you, Alice, and it's good to be back with all of you today to talk about a new case. This is the case of Ben McDaniel. And as we said in the introduction, this is a little different. This is a disappearance, but a strange one. And I'm really interested to hear what Alice thinks happened in this case. But for those of you who don't know this case, this is one of the more obscure ones we've done. People cover this case, but nowhere near as much as some of the other cases we've talked about. And we're going to take you back to 2010. And on August 20th, 2010, Employees at a dive shop near Vortex Spring in Ponce de Leon, Florida, noticed that a pickup truck had been parked at the shop for several days. Concerned, they called the sheriff's office. When officers opened up the truck, they discovered it belonged to Ben McDaniel, and a mystery began.
This is probably too early to say it, but that already smells fishy to me because those. So Brett, I know we haven't even gotten to the story, but I am a certified scuba diver, and the thing with the scuba diving community is it's a very close knit community. You know, if you've ever been to the same dive shop, if you regularly dive somewhere, you all get to know each other because you share equipment, you rent equipment, things break, you need a new valve, what have you. And it would be difficult not to notice a truck that's just sitting there because every night people leave and they go home. I will tell you already, my spidey senses are going up that it takes them several days to notice that a pickup truck is at the shop before they call the police.
I think it's a very important point, and it's one that we're going to come back to again and again in this case, because Alice is right. Vortex Spring, we're going to talk about this a little bit more about Vortex Spring and what it's like, but this is not some massive, dive shop with thousands of people coming through all the time. Alice is right. This is a tight community. These are people who know each other, and the fact that several days had passed, it does already make you wonder what exactly is going on here. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about who Ben McDaniel was. It had been a rough few years for Ben. In 2008, Ben's brother, Paul, died from what his family would later describe as a stroke or brain hemorrhage. He was only 22 years old, and a closer read of his autopsy would cast doubt on the story that the family told and perhaps wanted people to believe about Paul. Rather than a stroke, the autopsy indicated that Paul may have died of a drug overdose. Despite this, the family would start a foundation in Paul's name for the treatment and prevention of strokes. Whatever the cause of death, one thing that cannot be doubted is that it was Ben who found Paul unconscious in his parents' home. He attempted to revive him. He attempted CPR, but it was to no avail. And this was the first of a number of personal tragedies that would dog Ben. Within the next 2 years, Ben's construction business would fail, leaving him in debt and owing tens of thousands of dollars to the IRS. He also engaged in some failed real estate deals that cost him even more money and led to him having to sell his home to pay for more than $500,000 in debt that he had accrued. And it wasn't just the business side, though I'm sure business had an impact on his personal life, which suffered as well. He would go through a painful divorce from his wife. His life was spiraling, and his parents reached out with a suggestion. He should take a year-long sabbatical, figure things out, figure out where he wanted to go with his life. And in order to facilitate that, his parents offered him the family's vacation home in Destin, Florida, on the state's Emerald Coast. And Ben accepted that very generous offer.
Find yourself looking for a new job or change in career? Monster.com is here to help. We are not only here to bring you job postings, but also AI interview prep and salary tools, expert career advice, and top-notch resume services. We've got everything you need to land your perfect job fit. Discover the magic of finding the ideal job with Monster.com. Your future starts now. Visit Monster.com today. Your next job opportunity is just a click away.
If you're looking to streamline your audio advertising buys and maximize your revenue, look no further than Triton Digital's programmatic audio advertising exchange, A2X. The private exchange consists of only licensed broadcasters and top-tier internet radio publishers, assuring the quality inventory and brand safety you can trust. Visit www.tritondigital.com to learn more.
So now that Ben was back on the coast, his love for diving was rekindled. He'd been diving his entire life, and now with his mind clear, he realized that he could turn that passion into a business. He realized that if he became a master diver, he could own a dive shop, he could teach diving, and he could live on the coast as he'd always wanted. And Ben was an excellent open water diver, but he was drawn to something more interesting, something more exciting, and that's when he found the Vortex. Vortex Spring was a local freshwater diving spot on the coast of Florida. The highlight of Vortex is a cave. Now, about 300 feet into the cave, there is a gate and a sign. The sign features a picture of the Grim Reaper, and it says, "Stop, prevent your death. Go no farther. There is nothing in this cave worth dying for." Talk about an ominous sign, Brett.
If I saw that sign, I would just stop.
I would turn around. These are not common. I mean, I've dived, quite a bit in open water, exploring caves, in very deep areas. I've gone spearfishing without any sort of scuba gear. And these types of signs really are not common because remember, those who are drawn to scuba diving already have a risk-loving nature. Because if you haven't gone scuba diving before, I mean, truly, you are underwater. If you don't manage your oxygen well, if something goes wrong, if you come up too quickly, you can die. Embolisms can happen. You can quite literally run out of air. These are all truly life and death situations. And people who scuba dive love this. They love the thrill of truly living on the edge and exploring a part of the world that few get to see on a daily basis. So the fact that other divers have put up this sign, a warning, is a big deal. This is already a risk-loving community. For this sign to appear, it must be serious. And in fact, it is, because cave diving in and of itself is the most dangerous recreational activity you can engage in because of small crevices, because of unknown and changing topography of the cave, because of the difficulty of getting life-saving equipment into the cave in order to help you should you lose consciousness, should you get lost, should you lose air. In cave diving, more people have died doing it than any other type of diving activity. Now, the sign and the gate were added after 13 divers drowned while exploring the cave in the early 90s. For this particular cave, the state was clear. It was just too dangerous. It was much too big of a liability after so many divers had drowned while exploring it. The state said, we're going to close the cave, or you have to put up this gate and this sign. And so that's why the gate was put up and the sign was added. And this gate was closed and locked. Only certified divers were allowed through the gate, and only workers at the Vortex had a key. And this brings us to August 18th, 2010.
Can I just say, Alice, I feel like I learn something new about you every time we do one of these podcasts. I don't understand how you can be everything that you are. It's amazing. One day I look forward to telling the story of when you were a fiddler in a bluegrass band that toured the state of Virginia, but that'll have to wait for another time.
Sorry, my microphone fell over because I was laughing, but trying not to shake the microphone. I'm laughing because, well, you'll just have to find a bluegrass fiddling true crime story for us to talk about.
I know, exactly.
And can I tell you that this is like a long-standing joke with my friends? I think I have really bad memories because I forget I do these things until something like this story comes up. I'm like, oh yeah, I dive. I mean, clearly I haven't, dove in a few years at this point, partly, COVID and, kids and being a lawyer. But
right.
Yeah, I just totally forgot about this. So this is kind of exciting for me to remember what it was like diving.
It's just, you're younger than I am, and yet you've done so much more. I just can't, I don't know. It's hard for me to... It's sort of embarrassing.
Brett, it's really easy to do things when you're young. I feel like I did everything in my life before I turned 25.
Apparently. Apparently.
And by this point,
Anyway.
I'm just same old. Okay, so let's dive into
But now
the
you've
timeline.
started a true crime podcast, so
Which, really quick, I'm just going to do a quick shout out to Grayson, who wrote to us because she and I went to college, but I had no idea she listened to my podcast, and she wrote a really nice note. So thanks, Grayson. I hope you're listening.
she did, and we're gonna cover that case that Grayson mentioned because it seems really interesting. But yeah, let's dive into the timeline. So we'll start quickly in 1994, which is when Ben learned to open water dive when he was only 14 years old. It became one of his passions, and he soon earns his certification. As we're going to talk about, there's a big difference between open water diving and cave diving. These are very different activities, but Ben was really good at the one, and he decided to take that knowledge and pour it into cave diving. So let's go all the way forward to August 18th, 2010. So Ben, he's been down on the coast for several months now. He's doing this thing where he's reimagining his life. He has a girlfriend. He's living in his family's home. They are financing him. So basically, he spends every day diving, where the home is about an hour away from Vortex. So he's driving to Vortex every day, parking his truck near the dive shop, and then spending the day down in the cave.
Which, by the way, Brett, just goes to the point that I was making earlier, that if he's coming in, that he has no other job. His job is diving, and this is a great spot to dive. The people who scuba dive in this area know him.
Absolutely. And that's actually going to play a part in how this all went down. Now, Vortex Cave, it has some interesting aspects to it. Vortex is a freshwater cave, so he's not, even though Florida is on the Gulf Coast, he's not diving out in the saltwater. He's diving in this freshwater cave. It also maintains a pretty consistent temperature, so it's something you can dive year-round. I have a friend, I'm going to talk about him more as we go through this. He is a diver in Florida. He teaches folks how to dive. He has dived at Vortex over 100 times, so he had some really interesting insight on this. And he said they would often take new divers to Vortex because basically it offers this opportunity to dive year-round in this freshwater in sort of a confined space. And initially, you know, we're talking about cave diving, but really imagine this sort of open, almost like a whale, right? So you have this open space and you dive straight down, you reach the bottom, and then there's a cave sort of running off from that. The cave is what we're going to be talking about a lot, but that central area of Vortex is a really great place if you've never dived before to sort of learn what you're doing and not have to worry too much about being in open water. So on this day, August 18th, 2010, Ben, who is 6'2", we're going to talk about that some more, that matters, so remember that, and dives Vortex Cave. Now, you may wonder, we just told you, you can only dive Vortex if you're a certified diver, and Ben's not. Ben is a open water diver. He's learning how to cave dive, but he's doing it on his own. It's not as if he's taking classes, and he's certainly not certified to do it. So how exactly is he diving this cave? There's the gate, and the gate's locked. Well, Ben had been forcing his way through the gate so that he could dive the cave, even though he was not allowed to do so. So he would go down, he'd reach the cave. It's a little unclear exactly how he did this. He either went under it or over it. Not entirely clear, but either way, he wasn't using the key. He was forcing his way in, and that's what he did this morning. He dives down, spends some time in the cave, he then resurfaces, he fills his tanks, which are empty at this point, and he spends the afternoon sort of messing with his equipment and making notes in his very extensive dive log.
At 7:30 p.m. that night, Eduardo Turan, a commercial diver and an employee of Vortex, comes up with another diver from his last dive of the day. Now, Eduardo sees Ben making his way back into the Vortex. Remember, Ben is not allowed in the Vortex. Eduardo knew Ben And he also knew that Ben had a habit of breaking through the gate in Vortex to access the more dangerous parts of the cave. He turned back, dived down, and used the key that he had, since he was a certified cave diver, to let Ben pass through without Ben having to break his way into the gate. Now, according to the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Turan had, in the past, waited on the shore until he saw the bubbles from Ben's decompression and knew that he was okay. But Ben had been around so long that he'd grown comfortable with him, and that day, Eduardo did not wait to make sure Ben was okay. No one would ever see Ben alive again. Again, I'd like to point out how Eduardo knew Ben so well and knew his habits, that he was letting a friend through a gate that he wasn't supposed to go through. So that's how familiar he was with Ben. You don't do this to some tourist who's there for the day. You do this to someone that you are comfortable with, you've known very well.
Eduardo would later say that, and I can already imagine some of you are wondering what's going on here. If you can't go through the gate and he knows he's going through the gate, why doesn't he report him? Why doesn't he call the police or whatever? Going back to the dive community, the dive community is one of those communities that's fiercely independent. They're not a big fan of regulation at all. they're not too happy about the state even telling them they have to put up this gate. They're happy to do it in a way because it's been so deadly, but they don't like being told to do it. No diver is going to report Ben to the authorities because he's forcing his way through the gate. That's just not how it's going to work. Now, what Eduardo knew was that it took Ben some time to get through that gate. And as we're going to talk about, cave diving is already difficult and it's already dangerous. And Eduardo basically thought that the time Ben was taking to get through the gate could be the difference between him making it out of that cave or not. He's spending air, he's spending energy when he's doing that. So Eduardo thought, if he's going to go through anyway, I might as well just let him go through. And then he didn't have to worry about that. It'll actually be safer for him. And so that's why Eduardo does this. If you wonder why the Memphis Commercial Appeal is writing articles about this, Ben is from Memphis and his family is from Memphis. So that is a newspaper that's had a lot of articles on this, and we're going to link to some of the things they talked about. But what Alice said is important as well. This goes to the fact that the people at the dive shop knew Ben. Ben hadn't just driven up that day and done this dive. People knew Ben, they knew his habits, they knew what he was about. And that's going to be important, I think, in this story.
And Brett, that's a great point that you make as well, that divers are not going to report other divers because remember, the only reason this gate is up because the state threatened to close the Vortex cave completely. So the divers were like, fine, we'll put up the gate just so that we can keep it open. They don't want the gate there. Absolutely not. And if anything, divers like to push each other. They like to share their knowledge of, new places they've dived. That's why there's a dive log. That's partly why there's a dive log, to share your experiences with others, because it's a very communal community, right? You like to share information. You like to share your gear. You like to share kind of the exciting things you're on the edge of discovering. And that's what's happening here.
And I want to point out one thing. My friend who has dived Vortex many times, he talks about this gate and how dumb the gate is. How only government would force you to put this gate up. Because imagine this scenario. You dive into the cave. You go through the gate. You're allowed to do that. And then somebody leaves the cave and doesn't realize you're still in the cave. And then they close the gate behind them and lock it. And now you're in the cave and you're locked in the cave, right? So not a good thing. So actually at Vortex, there is a pair of bolt cutters that hang from the wall. So you can actually cut through the lock if you need to. If you get locked in, you can cut through the lock and get yourself out. So it's sort of a weird situation with this gate.
That sounds terrifying. That you could be locked inside the gate. And so now Lowell Kelly, the owner of Vortex Spring, would later tell the police that night, a wild-eyed man of about 35 years old, who was clearly drunk, showed up at the dive shop to see if it was too late to go diving. Kelly thought this was strange, and despite this, Kelly believed that Ben planned and executed his own disappearance. if you are scratching your head like, what? I agree. This is very confusing and a strange thing to be telling the police.
Yeah, this is really weird. So this should raise red flags for you. and Lowell Kelly is a guy who people have their suspicions about. We're going to talk about him more. But a couple things about this. This is so convenient, right? I mean, so Lowell Kelly says he never stays at the dive shop at night. He's always one of the first people to leave. His employees are the last people there. But the story when he tells this, he says he just happened to be there that night. And as he's leaving, he sees this guy who wants to go diving, who's drunk. And he's like, whatever, man, you don't need to go diving. You clearly are too drunk to dive. And he leaves. But on the one hand, he tells this story, which is awfully convenient for the day that Ben disappears. And on the other, he's like, but I don't think that guy had anything to do with it because I think Ben disappeared on his own, which we'll come back to that theory as well. So this is a very strange thing that Lowell is saying and may color how you look at this case as we continue to go through it.
Indeed. So about 2 days later, August 20th, 2010, Taryn calls the sheriff's department about this truck that had been sitting outside. Now, remember, this sounds a little bit weird. Eduardo is the one who let Ben into the vortex with his key. So you would think that he knows Ben well enough, he probably knows his car. But still, for whatever reason, he waits 2 days, the car is sitting there. They're like, it's strange that this car is sitting there. They call the sheriff's department.
Now, before you get to what the sheriff's department found, we got to stop and talk about this some more because you said it's strange a couple times, and it is strange. Remember what Eduardo told the newspaper, that he was so concerned about Ben and Ben diving this cave that he would sit on the shore and wait to see the bubbles from his regulator to know that he was fine and had gotten out of the cave. He didn't do that this night, but that is something he would do. He knows that he let Ben through. I mean, just imagine if you're him and you get to work the next day and that truck is still there. What would you think? I mean, would you not think?
Wow, crap. I didn't wait to see if he was okay.
Yeah, like my first thought, the first thing I would do is I would throw on my dive gear and I would go down to just make sure, like maybe he just got there early that day. You know, he left really late and he got there really early, but I would go down there to make sure because I'd be thinking, I let him through the gate late last night, and his truck's still here. And that's a really dangerous cave, and he doesn't know what he's doing. All these things would go through your head, and you know all these things are true, but apparently that doesn't happen. And nobody even notices for a couple more days.
Right. You know, it's interesting because Ben's probably there all the time. So it might be strange that he's not even showing up the next day or the day after, especially if he's so interested in this cave, for him not to show up. Now, the sheriff's department shows up and they enter Ben's truck. They find a wallet with $681 in cash inside, as well as his cell phone. This makes sense. You don't dive with your cell phone. It would make sense that his cell phone would still be in his truck, and this would also point to the fact that perhaps he is still in the water, or his last place was the water. Now, his final phone call had been to his mother. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and they hit upon 2 spots, one along the bank and one in the water itself. However, as the days passed, there was no further signs of any decomposition in the water. Typically, if something is decomposing in the water, you would expect that things would wash up or the dogs would hit on different places as a decomposing body is being drawn in and out with the tide.
And you would also expect to see scavengers in the water. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, you know, people who are experts in this expect to see when there's a body. And they didn't see any of that. And remember, this is essentially a closed system. It's not as if he's in the ocean, right? So there's only a certain amount of places he could be down there. And if his body is decomposing in some crevice somewhere, you would expect to see some signs of that. And yet, no one sees anything.
So for the next 36 days, that's a very long time, by the way, 16 divers scoured the cave looking for any sign of Ben's body. Just so you know, that's also a very large number of divers for an extended period of time looking for them. Divers are brought in. Divers actually often join in on these searches because, not everyone can participate in these searches. Not everyone can dive. And so this is very common for the diving community to come together when one of their own goes missing, because it could be any of them. And they scour this cave for 36 days and they found absolutely nothing.
Yeah, nothing at all. Not a sign of Ben's existence. And it wasn't just rando cave divers either. It was some of the best cave divers in the world. By August 23rd, 2010, Ed Sorensen arrives on the scene. If you know anything about cave diving, you know who Ed Sorensen is. He is an internationally known cave rescue diver. I was talking to my friend about this, and the first person he mentioned was Ed Sorensen. And Ed Sorensen is often called upon to go into these caves and retrieve bodies. And he has never dived a cave that he did not bring back the body he was looking for, except in one instance. This one. So he's a premier expert in the world on this type of exploration. He's called in to do this. He agrees to go further into this cave than anyone has gone before to look for Ben. This is a good time to describe for you what this cave is like. You know, you may be thinking of sort of, I don't know, a cave you see in a movie or whatever. You go into the mouth of the cave and it opens up into this big, beautiful cavern with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites coming from the floor, or vice versa, however they work. That's not exactly how it is. So these caves are more like, in this cave in particular, it's like a long hallway with rooms connected by other hallways. But the hallways are very narrow. They call them restrictions for a reason. So essentially, you have an opening, and then it closes down to a restriction that could be inches wide. And if you want to get from one chamber, one room to another, you have to pass through that restriction. Ed Sorensen has passed through restrictions as small as, I think, 8 inches. He's gone through that small restriction. So you sort of squeeze through that, and then it opens up again. And then you squeeze through another one, and it opens up again. And they tend to get more and more narrow as you go further and further into the cave. And so Ed says, I will go further than anybody has ever gone before, under the theory that Ben essentially worked himself through a restriction nobody's worked himself through before, and then ended up in a place where he could not get back. So Ed's going to make that dive. He makes 3 dives, going a full 200 feet further than Ben had mapped. Remember, Ben has these really complex maps and notes that he's keeping in his dive log, and his dive log was found in his truck. And one of the things Ben is doing is he's mapping this cave. And so we know how far he'd gone before, up into this dive, because, as we said, he spent the rest of that day working on his dive log. So we can assume that the last entry in his dive log with this map is as far as he had ever gone. Now he's going back into the cave. Maybe he's going to go a little further. And the idea that Ed's working on is, if I go further, maybe I'll find him. And he goes a full 200 feet farther than Ben had into this cave.
And for a complex cave like this, 200 feet further is incredibly far. It would take Ben, if he hadn't gone these extra 200 feet, it would have taken him probably weeks, if not longer, of diving to have mapped this out, to have figured out the cave. So this is incredibly advanced for Ed to be doing.
And look, if you're claustrophobic, do not watch videos on cave diving, because it is incredibly claustrophobic. There is a documentary on this case called Ben's Vortex, and you can see some of this. It's great. You can find it online. Worth watching. But like I said, if you're claustrophobic, you don't necessarily want to watch that. Ed Sorensen has a bunch of videos on YouTube of him doing this. And what he does, when you think about somebody who's scuba diving, they have the tanks on their back and they're, swimming around. Well, you actually take the tanks off and you hold them in front of you to make yourself more narrow, and you push the tanks through in front of you, and you follow the tanks. And so that's how you're sort of squeezing through these very small spaces, and he is the expert on doing this. And he's also much smaller than Ben. Remember, we said this earlier. Ben's 6'2". He's not a skinny or a small guy. And if you see pictures of him or you see the documentary, you see that. He's a big guy. And Ed's much smaller, and he's an expert. If Ben could go there, Ed could go there. And he's going as deep as anyone's ever gone into this cave. And it's hard to imagine, very difficult to imagine that Ben could have gone farther than Ed. But Ed has said that although it might be possible to go further than he had gone, you would not be coming back out. So Ed is pretty adamant that he went as far into that cave as anyone could go and hope to come out. And he could not go further and survive the dive. But that's the only time Ed has ever dived into a cave and not brought back the person he was looking for.
And by the way, the reason, Ed sounds like an incredible diver, and his success rate of finding bodies is amazing. But part of the reason he is able to is because these caves, it's not open water. There's nowhere for people to go once you go into these tunnels. What happens typically is someone dives in and they get trapped. They either lose their bearings and they don't know which way they've been going, so they burrow in deeper and deeper and deeper until they run out of air, or they truly just get lost and get stuck in a place that they cannot get out of. And so it's not like they're out at open sea and the wave comes and they're pulled away. And it would be quite impossible, really, to find someone who's lost at sea, right, if you didn't know where to go. But not in these caves. There's just no other outlet. And that's why Ed is always able to find a body, because the key is just to go deeper and further than the diver had gone. And he is so good at navigating that he is able to do so, something that is very difficult for most people to do. So I want to explain why he has such a high success rate. If there is a body in there, he should find it.
And this, in some ways, this is almost like the Brian Schaefer case, because if Ben is in there, he's still there. Like if his body is somewhere in that cave, if he died in that cave, he's still there. He hasn't, like Alice said, he hasn't been pulled out to sea. There's nothing that's happened to him. He's still there. Another interesting thing about this cave, there are caves that have sort of like little crevices and blind alleys and all this other stuff, right? And you might think, well, maybe he turned down one of those or he got stuck in a crevice. This particular cave is not like that. It isn't really that interesting a cave when it comes to that kind of thing. So there really aren't that many places that Ben could be. He's either not in the cave or he is further than even Ed Sorensen could go into that cave.
One interesting thing to note is that, very advanced divers dive alone, but typically you dive with someone else, especially with something this complex, because it's helpful to have a friend to know what's happening. There's no cell phone down there. There's no way to send for help if you are in too deep. And so Ben is already in a very compromised position to begin with, but I think alone he can only go so far. And if Ed went that far, I don't think that that Ben was able to go any further than what Ed was able to dive. We're going to fast forward. No body was found. January 20th, 2012. So this is 2 years later, a year and a half later. Vortex Springs held a chili cook-off competition. Now, during the event, Kelly, remember who owned the dive shop, drank some moonshine, lots of it. And for those of you who have never had moonshine, it is quite strong. It can burn your nose hairs off.
After
what?
This is over. I have a moonshine story.
I was actually lobbing that up for you to tell a moonshine story, because I can only imagine how many moonshine stories you have. Anyways, it can burn, your nose hairs off. It's strong stuff. And by the time night fell during that chili cook-off competition, Kelly was very, very drunk. He had a very good night until it wasn't. Some friends helped Kelly back to his home, but Kelly slipped and he fell off his balcony, hitting his head. Now, his friends were not that concerned about him. They just thought it was a drunken fall, and they put Kelly in a bathtub and left him there for the night, figuring that Kelly would just sober up and it was a safe place to be. But instead, Unfortunately and tragically, Kelly lost consciousness in the night and he passed away. So there's no more asking him any questions. A year and a half later, after Ben's disappearance, Kelly is gone.
And Kelly is an interesting character, and he's a character that people have a lot of suspicion about, a lot of questions about. People think this is a suspicious death because I think for a lot of people this seems strange, that your friend would fall and hit his head because he's drunk and you put him in a bathtub. Doesn't actually strike me as that unusual. This feels like a very Gulf Coast, Florida thing to do, personally. But so I don't actually think it's that weird. I think this probably is exactly what happened. But it is certainly true that whatever Kelly knew about this, and whatever he knew about this mysterious person who showed up drunk that night that Ben disappeared, went to the grave with him. So something to remember. So my moonshine story. I think this is an interesting story, but fast forward 30 seconds if you don't like asides. When I used to work in the Senate, the United States Senate. I worked for a senator from Ohio. So there's one Republican and one Democrat, so we can remain, bipartisan because you don't know which one I worked for. And one of the things we would do on occasion is go to other senators' offices and meet with the staff and sort of make friends. And so one day after work, it was like after 5 o'clock, I got an email from the West Virginia office, Joe Manchin's office, saying like, Senator's gone, if you want to come by and say hello, now's a good time. So I went down and I met all these people who work for Joe Manchin, and we were having some beers or whatever and chatting. And then Joe Manchin walks in because he had like forgotten something. So he walks in on all of us like drinking beer in his office, which, you might imagine he would get angry about. But instead, he's like, come in for a second. So I go into Joe Manchin's office, and he sits down behind his desk, and he reaches into the desk, and he pulls out a mason jar. And it's just a mason jar with a top on it. It's got no label or anything. It's filled with like clear liquid. And he's like, have some of that. And so I open it up and pour it into a cup. And of course, it's moonshine from West Virginia. He's like, yeah, one of my good friends made that. And it was excellent. So that's my moonshine story. The time I drank moonshine with the United States Senator.
I gotta say, moonshine from West Virginia is like the real deal. That's some strong stuff.
I don't know why people drink it. I mean, it didn't taste good. It's
like really good if you want to take paint off your walls.
Exactly. Exactly. So, okay, so that's the timeline. That's the story of what happened here. And that was 2012, and there hadn't been that many updates since. So let's dive into these details a little bit more. Now, we've talked about these logbooks that Ben was keeping. And in the logbooks Ben was keeping of his dive, searchers found this map we talked about. And it indicated that he had gone deeper into the cave than anyone had suspected. People knew that he was diving the cave, but they did not know he was going this deep, and far deeper than what was considered safe. But some of the people who are experts in the area who have looked at these logbooks say that there are some weird things about it. For one, the map that he drew does not actually reflect the layout of the cave. And there are people who wonder whether the map was an elaborate ruse designed to make people think he was spending time in the cave when he was not. Now, why would he be doing that? Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but like every other disappearance case, there are people who think that Ben left to start a new life.
I do have to note, in some ways, this was his new life, though. He just ran away from all of his problems and was like living in paradise at his parents' vacation home. But we'll get to that.
That's a good point, Alice, but don't get ahead of us.
Don't get ahead of us. I can't help it, Brett. All right. There are some other unusual aspects. Lowell Kelly, as we've already mentioned. Kelly was the owner of Vortex Springs when Ben disappeared. And at the time of Ben's disappearance, Kelly was actually under indictment and awaiting trial on charges that he'd driven an employee into the woods. This is an intense allegation, by the way. He'd driven an employee into the woods, accused the employee of stealing $30,000, and then beat that employee with a baseball bat, which Kelly denied. So that's what he was under indictment for, something pretty violent. Now, given Kelly's penchant for violence, the fact that he was one of the last people to see Ben, and given Kelly's own unusual death, and his strange story about that drunk man who showed up asking if it was too late to dive, have gotten a lot of people wondering if Kelly was somehow involved in Ben's disappearance.
You know, I told you not to get ahead of things, but I'm going to go ahead and get ahead of things and say I don't think Kelly was involved, just because Kelly just reminds me of so many people I've met in my life. Like, he's exactly what I would expect from some guy who owns a dive shop down on the Florida coast. Like, he's going to have a criminal record. He's probably somebody who gets drunk. He's probably somebody who gets violent on occasion. Doesn't mean he's going to murder anybody, you know? Like, I feel like a lot of people live in a world where you're either a criminal or you're not a criminal. And I think there's a lot of in between, and particularly in a lot of sort of small communities where people have criminal records, but they're not really criminals, you know? And I realize Kelly was accused of beating a guy with a baseball bat, and that sounds pretty bad. But I don't know. To me, he's just kind of what I would expect.
It's kind of like coastal justice, man.
Yeah, that's the thing. You steal $30,000 from me. I'm not going to go to the cops. I'm going to take a baseball bat to you, you know? Like,
and I mean, not making light of this, but, you know, you mentioned earlier, and I think this is right, not all of the scuba diving community is independent minded, but you do have a lot of that kind of streak running through those who are drawn to risk-loving activities such as scuba diving. They are very independent minded. They don't like people telling them what to do. They just like to handle things themselves. They can dive into that cave themselves. They can take care of themselves. They take their own lives into their hands every day when they go diving. They are very independent. They can take care of themselves. And so, yes, if he did this would be bad for him to go beat someone, you know, in the woods with a baseball bat. But is it unheard of in kind of these circles? And did he, you know, was this his way of dealing with the $30,000 stolen? Maybe. Doesn't make it right. As prosecutors, we kind of have to say that. But just saying, I understand this community that he's in, and it doesn't necessarily mean Kelly was out to go kill Ben.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these sort of niche communities, I know a lot of people who are pilots, who have their own pilot's license, who fly like small planes all over the place. And they're very, you know, libertarian in their thinking. There's something, I think, that drives people to do that, who they want to be sort of free and unconstrained and do their own thing. And I feel like diving is similar. And don't send me a bunch of emails saying that, you know, you're like not a libertarian and you love to fly. I get that there are exceptions, but I'm just saying the community in general strikes me very similar, those two communities. So it makes sense to me that this is sort of something you would do if you were in Lowell's position. So we've talked about how there's not a lot of evidence of Ben being in that cave, but that doesn't mean there was no evidence. There were 2 spare tanks found belonging to Ben near the entrance of the cave. Now, this is not unusual for cave divers, as they will often leave spare tanks behind them. But when they do, they often leave them more like breadcrumbs, sort of behind them as they go along in case they run into trouble. Now, you have to understand diving to understand this. If you're a deep water diver and you're not a cave diver, if you've ever dived below what is considered recreational diving, I think it's 150 feet, maybe. Alice, you may be able to correct me, but if you dive below that level, you're going to have to resurface slowly. And the reason you're going to have to do that is because the nitrogen bubbles in your blood, they've become bubbles basically because of the different pressure. And if you've ever heard of the bends or decompression sickness, that happens because you surface too quickly. So you have to surface slowly to allow the pressure to gradually lower on your body and the nitrogen bubbles in your blood to return to sort of the standard way that they are before you leave the water. And that way you won't have the bends, you won't have decompression sickness. So you have to plan for that. And If you go down and you use up all your air and you don't have any air for the hour-long resurfacing process, that's going to be a problem for you. So you're going to carry spare tanks. Very similar thing with cave diving. Number one, the depths are usually pretty deep, so you have to deal with the pressure issue as well. And you can't resurface quickly if you have a problem. So if your regulator goes out or something happens with one of your tanks, you can't just go to the surface because there is a cave above you. You have to get out of the cave and then resurface. So a lot of times cave divers will leave these extra tanks behind them, so if they have a problem, they can just go to one of their extra tanks, hook it up, and then, problem solved. They don't have to actually get out of the water immediately to solve their problem. The thing about this, though, is these tanks don't make any sense. Number one, they don't make any sense where they are. They're outside of the cave. They're near the entrance of the cave. It's not really where you would need them. You would expect someone to take them farther into the cave if they were going to use them in case of emergency. Number two, they don't have a gas mix in them, which is what you'd expect for cave divers or anyone who dives below that level I was discussing. They just have regular air. And the problem with that, returning to nitrogen is, it's an intoxicant for one thing. And if you're breathing regular air at pressure, you actually have an issue where you begin to lose some of your functioning. This is difficult to describe if you've never experienced this, but it's a lot harder to do things underwater when you're breathing regular air at pressure than it is otherwise. Your thoughts are slower. You don't have as much control over your hands, for instance. It's almost like being drunk, like a sort of low level intoxication. So a lot of people use this mixture of gas rather than regular air for that specific reason. And any cave diver would use a gas mixture. And yet these tanks contain regular air, and people who've looked at them say they're just issues with them. One of them was half filled, which doesn't make any sense. You certainly would fill it all the way. One of them didn't have a regulator on it. I don't know if regulator is the right word, but it didn't have what you would need to actually connect it.
In other words, it's not usable.
It's not usable. Yeah, it wasn't a usable tank. I mean, it's a tank down there, but it's not something you're going to be able to use, which is very strange if it's down there for an emergency.
I mean, I'm just going to say what it sounds like, Brett. It sounds like someone placed them there to make it seem like Ben left a trail behind him, when in fact none of these would have actually been helpful to Ben had he needed the extra tanks. So it makes no sense why he would have expended the energy and the oxygen. Remember, every additional energy you expend requires air, and you use up your air faster when you swim faster, when you breathe faster, when you carry loads that you don't need. This is why you do minimal effort when you are diving, especially something like cave diving, where you do have to make sure you have enough air. So it doesn't really make sense for him to be bringing two tanks along that are heavy, cause him to use up air more quickly when these tanks are useless to him. Another unusual aspect is the signs of Ben. Remember, we said that Ben is 6 feet 2 inches tall. So he's a tall guy. He's definitely not small. And if he went into the cave, even if he went further, there should have been signs like marks in the sand, marks in the limestone, in the ceiling, just signs that a diver was squeezing their way through these tunnels and kind of hallways of the cave. Now, Ed stated that there would be so many signs of Ben's presence that it would take 30 years of erosion and settlement for those signs to be wiped away. But he didn't see those types of signs, not deep in. In other words, Ed didn't see signs of Ben going as deep as Ed had gone. And if Ed had gone further than Ben, Ed should have found Ben if Ben were in the cave.
I mean, it's one of those things. You can just imagine this. We've talked about these restrictions. If someone is squeezing through this restriction, even if they make it through, they're going to leave behind evidence that they squeezed through. And what Ed's talking about here, their tanks are going to rub against the rock and leave a sign that they went through there. And Ed's not seeing any of that. He's going further and further into this tank, and it looks as if, or into this cave, and it looks as if no one has ever been there before, which doesn't make any sense if this really big guy was also squeezing through.
And this was fascinating to me because often I think of everything in the water being washed away really quickly. But these caves are not traversed often, right? There's the gate. There's not. You need to be certified. You need to have knowledge to go into this cave, and so not a lot of people are actually going through there. And the fact that Ed, who knows these caves well, says it takes 30 years of erosion for signs of Ben to be washed away, but he's diving within the month, within a week of Ben's disappearance, and he doesn't see those signs. That's a huge red flag right there.
Yeah, now, look, if you think Ben did disappear to start a new life, he didn't leave any signs of that either. His bank accounts, his phone, since he disappeared, there has been no activity on either one of those. And recall, his wallet was stuffed with cash. He left $631 in his wallet. And you would think if you're going to start a new life, you might want to take that money with you, but he did not do that. One other thing that people talk about a lot, and if you've seen the documentary Ben's Vortex, this is something that plays a large role at the end. There is a shovel deep inside the cave who a diver found when they were looking for Ben, and there was speculation that it was Ben's shovel, and this was actually evidence of Ben's presence deep inside the cave. But it has later been determined that this was another diver's shovel, so even that is not evidence of Ben's presence.
There are a lot of questions marks, Brett. Did Ben disappear to start a new life? Certainly no evidence of it. Was Ben murdered in one of the most difficult places to be murdered, so far underneath the surface of the water in these tiny caves where one man squeezing through leaves marks that stay for 30 years or more? That also seems like a difficult stretch, but what happened to Ben? A 6-foot-tall man doesn't just go into a cave and disappear when there's no other exit from the cave but the one that has been traversed looking for him.
Well, let's talk about theories. What did happen to Ben? And I guess we can start with what might be one of the more popular theories, particularly in the community. So there's a diving community. As Alice said, they're very close. They're very tight. And they talk about this case. And this is a really popular case that people talk about in the community. And a theory that is pretty popular is that Ben was murdered. And some people believe that Ben ran afoul of Lowell Kelly and his famous temper, and that somehow resulted in Ben's death. The theory goes that Lowell, with the assistance of his employees or maybe some friends, disposed of the body in a gator pond nearby and then planted the evidence of Ben's dive in the cave. It's an interesting theory. It's intriguing, and you can see why it's attractive. But the one problem that I have with this is there's really no evidence to support it. Now, maybe the gator ate all the evidence, but there's not any evidence to support it. And there's no reason to think that Lowell's employees would help him dispose of a body. But perhaps even more importantly, Lowell's dead, and he's been dead now for more than a decade. There's no reason to think that someone wouldn't at least leave maybe an anonymous message for the family, just revealing the location of Ben's body, particularly if it was Lowell himself who killed him. So you have to believe that unless Lowell did all this by himself, that there's some accomplice who, despite the fact Lowell's dead, has never revealed that secret.
Yeah, I mean, as sexy as that theory sounds, it would be difficult to murder him, and it would be difficult to keep it a secret for so long and to have no sign of a body after all this time.
And other than Lowell being a hothead, there's really no motive either. I mean, Ben's a paying customer. He's obviously paying a lot. Why are we killing Ben? I'm not sure. And, the reason it has to be an employee or whatnot, we have testimony from an employee who saw Ben going into the water. So you got to think he's either lying or the murder happened after that. It's a little shaky on the murder front.
Right. Well, let's maybe one step down from him being murdered. Another theory is that Ben died while he was exploring a cave he wasn't supposed to be in, and his body was moved. So this is definitely more believable. is that Ben wasn't murdered at all. He was just a guy who was diving for fun. He lived on the coast, and it didn't seem like anyone had anything out for him. But he was in a cave that he was not certified to dive in, and it's a difficult cave. 13 people had died before they put up the gate and the sign. It was a dangerous cave, and Ben was diving in it, and maybe he died. Now, under this theory, workers at the shop showed up the next morning. They realized maybe his car was still there, that he hadn't come back up from his last dive, and maybe they went down and they did find his body. And they were afraid of the consequences. What would this do to them? They had the keys. Eduardo had let him into that gate with his own key. This was the dive shop who was supposed to be responsible for keeping that gate locked. What would happen to this little dive shop? What would happen to the employees in it? And so, kind of in a panic, they took Ben's body and disposed of it somewhere, so that they wouldn't have to deal with the repercussions of a diver kind of dying essentially on their watch. Now, in this scenario, everyone is equally culpable, as they all helped dispose of the body. And this would explain why, the cadaver dogs had come. They hit on a scent right at the shoreline, and then at one point in the water, but there's no other sign of decomposition that you would normally see. And this would also explain why, after Ed dove, what he thought was 200 feet deeper than Ben had ever gone, he found no sign of Ben, and that there is in fact no evidence of Ben at all in the cave, whether his, other than this tank and the shovel that wasn't even his. There's so little evidence of him that it almost seems like someone had to have removed all evidence of him being in the cave.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. One we'll probably talk about a little bit more here in a second, but there's a lot going for it. Sexier theory, though, is that Ben, he's the one who set all this up. He's the one who made it look like he died in that cave, and he did that because he wanted to start a new life. Of all the disappearance cases that we've covered where starting a new life is suggested, this might be the one where that makes the most sense. Ben had a lot to run from. True, he's living the life of luxury down on the coast, but his problems are still there. He's still got those financial troubles, and in many ways, his life is in the process of collapsing. You could even say that his year-long sabbatical on the coast was him running away. He'd already sort of started that process. But there are things that cut against this. Ben was apparently very close to his family. Remember, his last call was to his mother. He had a girlfriend with whom he had a good relationship. If you've seen any of the documentaries on him or the Disappeared episode, she plays a prominent role in that. And perhaps most convincing of all for me, he left his dog behind. And who leaves their dog behind? I mean, even if you want to start a new life, are you really going to leave your dog? It's one thing to leave your family behind, but I just don't know. I don't know about the dog. So the dog sort of pushes it over the edge for me, that Ben probably did not run off to start a new life.
I think he was in this probably the happiest he'd been in a very long time, actually. After a divorce, after failing businesses, having to sell his home, paying off $500,000 of debts, and finally he was kind of resurfacing from all of this crushing trauma in his life. He was living in Destin, rent-free at his parents' vacation home, and exploring a passion that he thought, that had fallen to the wayside in the midst of the busyness of life. So if anything, this was the escape. He was in the escape. Where would he escape from here? He doesn't really have a bunch of financial resources. He was essentially, having his very relaxed life being paid for by his parents, and he leaves a ton of money behind. I'm not sure what he'd be running from and how it would be much better than what he was experiencing and living here in Destin.
Yeah, I mean, if he had disappeared right after the lien and selling his house and the IRS and his divorce, that's one thing. But like you said, he really seems to sort of be recreating his life. And my buddy that I talked to a lot about this case, because he's very familiar with it and with the area, says this is pretty common, that there are people who sort of come down to the coast all the time to recreate their life. This is a popular thing to do. You often think about I'm going to move to the beach and open a bar thing. I mean, people say that all the time, right? Because that's sort of an attractive restart my life. Well, apparently going down and learning to dive and opening a dive shop is another one. So to me, I don't think he ran away because I think he already had. I think this was his runaway and this was his restart on life. So as sexy as the disappearance theory is, I don't think it works in this case.
And so that kind of leaves one last theory, and that is Ben is still in the cave. Cave rescue divers have pointed out that oftentimes when people are trapped in a cave, they panic, and this leads them to do strange things that we may find irrational, such as digging themselves further into the cave, maybe to places that no one's ever been. Maybe they're creating a hole that wasn't even there that they burrow into, and they can push further and further into narrow passages or get stuck in crevices off the main area that a normal person in their right mind diving through this cave would never even think of crawling into. Like Brett was saying earlier, when you're diving, if you're running out of air, your brain works in different ways as well, especially when you're panicked. It's dark. You're feeling your way by touch. You may not know up from down, especially in the water. And so it's possible that Ben is still there, but if he had to do that, if he had to dig his way into a tiny crevice, there would be signs of it. And this is exactly what Ed was looking for when he was diving to find Ben, and he didn't see any evidence of this. So, I mean, Ben might still be in there because we have no body. We have no idea where he is. So this is obviously going to be an option. I think unless his body's ever found. But I think it's difficult when there's just kind of no signs of him digging himself in a way that would be difficult to find him.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think until we find Ben, this is always going to be an option. And I think we can't rule it out. We've talked about Ed Sorensen, and he's been clear. He doesn't think Ben's there because he's been down there. He didn't see any sign of Ben. But there is another diver, Jill Heinerth, who... She's famous diver. She's a cave diver. She actually set the world record for the deepest dive by a woman. So she knows what she's doing. She actually worked on the Ben's Vortex documentary we've talked about several times. And in that documentary, she says something that I think is interesting when she talks about whether Ben could be further in that cave. And it sort of goes along with what Ed said, because Ed said he went as far into that cave as you could go and come out. And Jill says something along the lines of, the difference between me and maybe Ben is I want to come home at night. That's my ultimate goal is to get out. So there is a limit to how far she would go. And it's possible that Ben didn't know that limit. Remember, Ben is not a cave diver. Now, talking to my friend about this, I mean, a point he made again and again is one thing you have to consider about this is Ben is not qualified to do this. There are very few people who are qualified to do it. So some of the stuff you see might just be the fact that Ben has no idea what he's doing. He shouldn't be doing this. He doesn't have the training for it. So maybe he did go further than someone like Ed or someone like Jill would go because he didn't realize that in doing that, he had signed his own death warrant. I mean, that's a possibility, and it's a possibility that we can't discount. But I think this sort of brings us to our own views on this. What do we think happened? And Alice, being the expert scuba diver that you are, I'll let you give your theory first.
Well, I just don't think there's any signs that he was murdered. I do think Ben is dead. I do not think that he disappeared for all the reasons you have already stated. I think it was an accident and that he died somehow. But I don't think he's in that cave any longer because enough people have dived in this cave that with their expertise and the man hours that were spent searching the cave, 16 divers over 36 days, I think they would have found signs of him or located him or found things that led to the fact that there was a decomposing body in there, and none of that was ever found. That is very suspect. And so, Brett, I don't want to steal your thunder because I think you have a very good theory here, but I do think Ben died by accident, but something happened after the fact that removed him from where he died.
Yeah, and you're not stealing my thunder, Alice. You never could. But that's what I think happened. I think this is a case where I think it is a little bit more complicated than maybe what you would call the Occam's razor theory. I mean, the Occam's razor theory is obviously he's in the cave. That's the most obvious thing. He went diving. He dove down there. We know he went into the cave. He's still in the cave. That's, the easiest thing. The problem I have with that is, you and I, maybe not you, Alice, because you know what you're doing, but the rest of us here who aren't divers can say, well, obviously he's in the cave, right? But the people who know what they're doing, the people who are in that cave, people like Ed Sorensen, even Jill, who we mentioned earlier, who leaves the possibility open that he's there, did not find him there. My friend who's dived this cave 100 times has said he doesn't think he's there. Ed doesn't think he's there. There's no sign that he's there. There's no evidence that he's in that cave. The only evidence that he was in that cave is the story we've heard about an employee seeing him go in and those tanks. And the tanks themselves scream set up. They scream staged. And what I think happened here is that Ben went down there that night and something went wrong and he wasn't ready for it and he died. And I think somebody, whether it's Lowell or perhaps the employees, I don't know who it was, and I don't want to accuse anybody of doing this, but I think somebody found his body and realized this is bad. They knew that Ben came from money, and he did. They knew that his death would be a problem for Vortex. They knew it would probably lead to a lawsuit, given that he shouldn't have been there, and they knew he was there, and they did nothing to stop him. We've talked about how they weren't going to call the police on him. But when you look at a negligence standard, if you just look at the standard for negligence and how negligence works, you have a duty, a breach of duty, you have damages. I mean, you have everything here, right? You own the dive shop. You own the Vortex. You have a duty to ensure the safety of the people who go in. You have a breach of that duty because you allowed someone to do something that they're not allowed to do, but you let them do it anyway. I mean, it's like negligence. It's just right there. And I think somebody freaked out and said, we cannot have this happen here. We cannot have his body be found here. I think they put the tanks down there. I think they took his body and they disposed of it. That's what I think happened. I think Lowell probably knew that. He's dead now, and so we'll never know. But to me, when you just look at the evidence, the thing that makes the most sense is that.
I think you're really right there, Brett. We've noted, I think the diving community knew him. Eduardo knew him enough to actually get back in the water, put on his diving, probably just took out his mouthpiece, but he put it back in, even though he'd done his last dive for the day, to help out a friend, a buddy, someone he knew. I do not think it is conceivable that they would not have noticed that truck there the next morning and not have panicked. And I think that's just what they did. They panicked. This doesn't happen often. People don't know what to do in these situations. They knew that they could have gotten into a lot of trouble and it could have ruined their entire dive shop. And so they covered themselves.
And then you have Lowell. Lowell's story that he tells about the drunk guy showing up, right? I mean, just seems totally made up.
I think it's someone who's panicked, right? Doesn't know what to say. And he's just kind of speaking. And I think he probably knew what was going on or just panicked in general. The diving community talks. There's no way that the diving community here doesn't know something is up.
Yeah. And I think if you ask most people in the diving community, they think either that happened or Ben just disappeared on his own. But no one who's been in that cave thinks he's still there. And to me, that's significant. I just don't think he's there either. And I don't think it's some grand conspiracy. I don't think he was murdered, or anything like that. I think it's something much simpler. I think it was just people freaked out and they decided we're gonna cover this up. And they did. And that's why it's been a mystery to this point.
Well, Brett, this was a really, really interesting case. I hope you all have found it interesting as well. And here's the thing. I don't think if what you said happened, I don't think we'll ever actually know the truth unless someone talks. But it's been a long time. It's been 10 years, 11 years, and none of those employees or anyone who may have had something to do with moving Ben's body has talked, and I don't know that they will now.
I don't really think they have any reason to, and I think it's one of those things where there's no reason to talk, and I think people are going to go deeper and deeper into that cave over the years, and they're never going to find Ben. And maybe the fact that they don't find him, because look, it's not just Ben, right? It's not even one of those things where you imagine, his body is decayed and there's just nothing left. If you find Ben, you're going to find tanks. You're going to find all his equipment. Like, there's a lot of stuff in that cave that would still need to be there if Ben's there. So there's evidence of Ben's presence in that cave if he was ever in the cave. So, maybe one day they will find him and we can do a follow-up and talk about how wrong we were. But I don't think it's going to happen.
I think that's right. Well, Brett, this has been fun. By the way, I'm an open water diver. I do not dive caves. That sounds terrifying to me. So let's just put that out there. I could not dive this cave.
I don't know why anybody dives caves. I mean, that's what I was thinking about when I was watching it. And they keep talking about how beautiful it is. I'm sure it's beautiful, but, send me a picture or something. I would not want to do that. So if you're a cave diver and you have thoughts on this, we would love to hear it. And we'd love to hear from any of you. So if you do have thoughts, send us an email at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter @prosecutorspod. Join us on Patreon. Check us out on our website, prosecutorspodcast.com. We love hearing from you guys. We love interacting with all of you. Keep sending us those emails. I got to tell you, I have a bad habit, so I'm just going to go ahead and say this. If you send a really long, complicated, awesome email, chances are that I read it and I'm like, man, I want to respond to that, but I want to think about it. And so I mark it to respond to, and then I forget about it. So if you sent one of those really awesome emails and I never responded, just know I thought it was so awesome that I really needed to formulate some thoughts, and that's why I didn't respond. It's not because I didn't read it, but... Please keep reaching out to us. We love reading your emails. Keep leaving those reviews. Well, Alice, this has been fun. We're going to be back next week with a new case, one from Canada. We're branching out into other countries. So thank you for suggesting cases we haven't heard about. This is an interesting one because it involves some insanity defense issues that I think you'll like. But we'll be back with that next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Okay, time to rock and roll. Repeat everything Alice says.
These are original thoughts that have nothing to do with what you're saying, Brett. Oh, dear me.
Okay.
Bless your heart, Brett.
Oh, bless my heart.
Bless your heart. How does it always get to be so late without us even trying to be?
I don't know, because we just talk.
We just talk all the time.
We miss each other.
I do miss you. I miss you. Congratulations on a great trial.
Thank you. It's fun.
So I went into labor at like 11 a.m., right? By about 3 o'clock, I thought the baby was going to fall out of me. I'm not even kidding. I legit was like, this baby's going to roll out of me and it's going to be really awkward.
Jury would love that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, and I get up. I have been organizing my notes since about 4 o'clock, so I'm like, I'm for sure going to have a baby tonight.